So I want to start by talking about a Greek character by the name of Procrustes. He's kind of the Hannibal Lecter of Greek mythology. He was something of a serial killer. So Procrustes had a home on a kind of sacred passageway where travelers would frequently come by. And as he saw a traveler coming by, he would offer them to stay with him and have a night's rest. Which was obviously very welcoming for a weary traveler. He promised them that he had a magical bed that would fit them perfectly, regardless of their size. So he got quite a lot of people to come in. He'd cook them a feast and dine with them, pour them a few glasses of wine, tell jokes. I imagine he was a very charming character. And then after the meal, he would take them up to this room where this magical bed was. He would present them with the bed. And it was here where the trick was revealed, because the bed didn't conform to the guest so much as the guest had to conform to the bed. If the guest was too short, he would violently stretch them to fit. And if they were too tall, he would chop off their limbs. Now, I bring up Procrustes because a writer whom I very much admire, a man by the name of Alberto Mangel, who's written a lot about reading, which is near and dear to my heart. Also just a wonderful writer, like a good composer of stories and a wonderful composer of words, suggests in one of his books that perhaps Procrustes could be the patron saint of editors. And I want to talk about editing. And I know most of you are not editors. Well, most of you would not call yourself an editor, but I'm going to propose that you are, regardless of what your title is, regardless of what your trade is, or what you do day by day. I think editing is a foundational skill. I think it's something like writing or communicating, that no matter what our work is, we have to understand how to do it well. And so I want to talk about what makes a good edit and what the process for producing that edit is like. But first, I think we need to wrestle a little bit with this notion of the cut, of the slice, of the severance that you make with an edit, of the violence that an editor does to your work that Mangel hints at by suggesting Procrustes as our saint. This is a note that Frank Camaro left for me in my copy of The Shape of Design, a book that actually started as a talk here at Build and then evolved into a book. And Frank invited me to edit it, which is something I was very honored to do. I think it's one of the things I'm most proud of. Frank, I think, echoes some of Alberto Mangel in this notion of the violence that you do under work by calling me an axe sharpener. And he meant this earnestly. He was very brave, I think, in that editorial process. He asked me to really go at the work with a strong hand. But there's still that sense, even something that you invite in, it's kind of assaulting the work in a particular kind of way. But I think this invites the question of whether or not the cut, that notion of the cut that we associate with editing so readily, is really the full nature of what an edit is. I want to talk about film for a moment. In the 19-teens, there was a filmmaker by the name of Lev Kuleshov. He's a Russian filmmaker, very early in the history of film. Kuleshov was interested in how an audience interpreted an edit. When audiences were still getting used to what movies were like. They still didn't have the word movie, as Robin explained this morning. And so he wanted to understand what they saw when they saw film edited on a screen. So he performed kind of a user research project. He made 3 short films, each one just 2 shots. And he showed them to audiences. And then he asked the audience to report on what they saw, and in particular, to comment on the actor's performance. So I want to show you each of these 3 films. Here's the first one. Very short. Let me play it again. Bowl of soup. And then our actor. Now, when the audience saw this film and were asked to report on what they saw, they commented on the actor's performance and how he seemed really hungry. How maybe that bowl of soup was going to be his first meal of the day. They were very impressed with his performance, right? The second film takes the same structure, but a different context. Play that one again as well. So we have the young girl in the coffin, and then our actor. Now, when asked to report on this film, the audience talked about the grief that the actor portrayed, how sad he seemed, how tragic was the death of this young girl. The third film is again with the same structure, but a different subject. Here we have a young woman lounging suggestively. And when asked to comment on this film, the audience saw lust in his eyes and desire and longing for this young woman. Now, you're clever, so you've already caught the trick, which is that each of these shots of the actor is exactly the same. The actor was instructed to appear neutral and did not actually know what his shot was going to be combined with. He had not expressed hunger or lust or grief at all. He'd expressed nothing. He had just had a blank face. The audience saw those emotions in the juxtaposition of the shots. Now, Kuleshov's work was kind of one of the foundations of montage cinema. Perhaps the most famous example of is a slightly later film called Man with a Movie Camera, which follows a man with a movie camera around as he documents Soviet life. This was by Vertov in 1929. This is entirely a montage. It was shot in a documentary style. They just went around to different parts of the Soviet Union and shot people in their lives and the objects around them. It kind of has a kind of temporal notion of like the beginning of the film starts with the people getting ready for work, and then the middle is kind of them laboring along, and then the evenings where this clip is from is the partying and drinking and game playing that happens at the end of the day. There's no protagonist, there's no plot, there's no action. You never even really see what the man with the movie camera is recording. You see the things that happen around him. And Vertov, in addition to kind of experimenting with the notion of a story told entirely through montage, also pioneered a lot of new techniques. There were composite shots and cross dissolves, there's stop motion. A lot of these things had seen their first experience in this film. There's also some very fast editing. Critics of the day complained that Vertov didn't understand that one's eye needed to rest on a single shot before the next shot came along, thereby prefiguring complaints about MTV by about 50 years. Montage cinema remains an important technique available to film editors, and there's a couple of very famous examples. I think my favorite is from The Godfather, so I want to show a scene from that. This takes place near the end of the film, after Michael has assumed his position at the head of the family during the baptism of his son.
Michael, do you believe in God, the Father Almighty, creator of heaven and earth?
So there's two storylines here.
Do you believe in
One
Jesus Christ,
is
his only Son,
Michael
our Lord?
at the baptism of his son. And if you could hear it, the renounces Satan, and there's a number of kind of places. Do you renounce Satan? Do you renounce his work? Where he says very sincerely, very confidently that he does renounce Satan. And then at the same time, we can weave together the storyline of his henchmen who are out planning and are about to execute the murders which he has ordered. Now, you could tell this story differently. You could tell it one at a time. You could show the baptism, and then you could show the murders. And you would get the plot line the same way. The effect of what had actually happened would still be clear. But when you collide those two storylines, when you weave them together, you get a very different effect. Your interpretation of Michael's sincerity at the baptism has a completely different emotional quality to it. Instead of it seeming truthful, it seems sinister. Like he says he renounces Satan at the same moment that you see the actions demonstrating that he does not.
Michael Francis Rizzi, do you renounce Satan?
I do renounce.
In the course of the murders, it goes on. You see everyone murdered in the course of that exchange. We'll move on. What this tells me, what I think montage cinema shows me, is how it's not just the cut that makes an edit work, it's also the join. The join is kind of the response to the cut. It's the other side of it. You don't just cut something when you edit, you also have to join it with something else. And the join is actually where the meaning emerges in that exchange. It's not the pulling away or the leaving out, it's the bringing together that actually marks an edit. I have a little clip here of Hitchcock. He basically says that it's not, we call it cutting, and that's kind of a misnomer. We should really call it assembly.
We call it cutting. It isn't exactly that. Cutting implies severing something. It really should be called assembly. Mosaic is assembling something to create a whole.
It's an assembly of the whole that is actually what editing is about. You're working to make a coherent whole. That is the goal of an editor. So if our goal is the assembly of a whole, I think we have a couple of elements to play with in doing that. I'm going to come back to talking about text editing because I think that's the thing I spend most of my time with, and I think that's also useful for thinking about editing as a whole. The strike through, the move, and the margins are kind of the three elements that a text editor has at her disposal when she's working. The strike through is, of course, the part that strikes fear in us, the red ink, the scary, kind of frightening part of editing when you know something is going to hit the floor and it might be the thing you really wanted to make it through. But if you think about the join, if you think about things coming together and cohering as a whole, it starts to change the notion of what a strike means. Here is Theodore Adorno from Minima Moralia, which is a kind of a book of ruminations, almost kind of blog-like in its structure. And he has a number of sections where he talks about writing, but really about self-editing. And this is one that has stuck with me. He says, "It is part of the technique of writing to be able to discard ideas, even fertile ones, if the construction demands it." It's that even fertile ones that makes this hard. But if you can get past that, if you can understand that when you cut something, you're not passing judgment on it, you're just saying it doesn't fit. You're not saying it's not good, you're just saying it won't work here. Then the strike through starts to become a little bit easier. Coming back, I think the strike through is in many ways the thing we have the most anxiety about when it comes to editing, but it's the least important part of it. The move is really where I spend most of my time as an editor. When I say move, I'm talking about the reorganization, the kind of systems thinking that you have to do as an editor in order to make something work. This is the kind of messier part of the process, and notice I'm not talking about copy editing so much as like the structural edit or the developmental edit. It's kind of a different part of the process. Which isn't to say that copy editing isn't valuable, it is. Frank actually described a good copy edit as like getting a haircut and putting on a freshly pressed suit and going out the door looking your best. It's an enormously valuable part of the process, but it's not the only part, just like plating isn't the only part of cooking. We sometimes talk about the processes in editing as kind of temporal. You do a developmental edit, and then you do a copy edit, and then you do a proofread, and if God has mercy on your soul, you finish the damn thing, and it goes out into the world. But I actually like to think of it more in terms of kind of height or depth. You start out with, the developmental edit is kind of the 30,000 feet where the details are fuzzy, but the shape of things, the kind of border lines are clear. And as you get that structure in place, you start to move closer to the text. You go down where the details start to come into relief. So the move, this part of edit, doesn't actually happen on the text itself often. It happens on index cards strewn across a table or on a whiteboard or on a giant piece of graph paper or on Post-it notes kind of scattered around a wall. When Frank delivered the first full copy of his manuscript, he had kind of interesting structure that I quite liked at first. He had the chapters, which you would expect in a book, and in between each chapter were these little interludes that he called a respite. And they were designed, I think, as the title suggests, as a resting moment, as a pause in between the chapters. And the first couple of them were quite lovely. I remember being very excited about it and really enjoying them. They were shorter than the chapters. They were more focused on story than the chapters were. They were working quite well. But as Frank proceeded through the book, that structure started to become harder to see. The separation between the chapters and the respites was not as clear. Some of the respites were kind of bleeding into the chapters. Some of them got longer. You could no longer tell as a reader if you should be interpreting the respite differently than the chapter, if the voice was supposed to be different. So this is one of the first things that Frank and I talked about. There were a number of ways that Frank could have resolved this. He could have cut the respites because they weren't working. He could have moved them into the chapters. He could have had fewer of them, like kept the couple that were working and had it have been more of an occasional thing rather than something all the way through. But that was the kind, he ended up doing something kind of midway between that. He had kind of mined the respites for the parts that fit the best and moved them into the chapters. So there's little echoes of the respites in each of the chapters. A couple of them hit the floor completely. This is messy work, but there's also no true answer. Walter Murch who has wrote a book called In the Blink of an Eye about filmmaking. He actually worked on many of Coppola's later films, in The Godfather Part 2. He says that if you took DNA and considered it the dailies for a movie, and you gave 2 editors each a complete set of DNA and sent them off to go make their film, one of them would come back with a chimp and the other with a human. Neither of them is more right than the other. They're just different responses to the same set of materials, different systems that emerge from that same set. I think what's important about this process is recognizing that you have to get your hands dirty in it. This is a lovely writing environment for focusing, for getting out the words when you don't know what you need to say or where you're going. When where you've been doesn't matter yet. But you can't make moves here. You can't do a structural edit in an environment like this. Anne Lamott, a writer who wrote a book called Bird by Bird, I don't ordinarily recommend books on writing. I think the best way to learn about writing is to just write and read great books, and books on writing tend not to fall into the latter category. But I make an exception for Lamott. She calls perfectionism a mean, frozen form of idealism. And I think that rings true in editing and also in the work that we do on the web. One of the things that I've come to realize in thinking about Ethan and other people's writings in the last couple of years is how much the web has always been a messy place. And we had this kind of imposed order on it in the early days that felt kind of right, but was really false. And now with the 7 million devices out there, we can really see the mess for what it is. We have to build a website that's also going to work on a game console for teenagers in Malaysia, which has all of these technical and cultural complications inherent with them. I think you have to kind of engage with that mess and understand that it's part of the system, it's endemic. You're going to impose some order on it as an editor or as a designer, but it's never going to be complete. There's a saying in Okinawa, where I was born, called hara hachibu, and I'm probably saying that wrong. If anyone speaks Japanese and can correct me later, I will be very happy. But it means eat until you are 80% full, which, given that Okinawans are some of the longest-lived people on the planet, is probably good advice just on face value. But I also think about it a lot when I'm working in an edit, in that there's a point in the process where you need to let go. You need to know it's not going to be finished. It's not going to be perfect. Some of the incompleteness that we heard about just now. So that's the move. Now, the strike through and the move are things that you can do with yourself. There's as much tools of self-editing as they are working with others, but the margins is where the real collaboration happens. The margins are where you get to work with other people, and I think that's actually the most exciting part of an edit. We get kind of caught up in the visual, in the marks that an edit makes on a text, but it's really the things that happen outside of that that are most interesting and I think most productive. So it's useful to think about how we work together and what that relationship looks like. There's a very famous editor, American editor in the 20th century by the name of Max Perkins, probably the most famous editor of the 20th century. There aren't many famous editors, so it's a short list. Perkins was a fiction editor. He was at Scribner for many years. He was famous for working with writers over the whole length of their career for many decades. Some authors he worked with on their very first book to their very last. He was also known for championing early works by writers who may not have made their debut otherwise. He famously threatened to quit when the editorial board at Scribner refused to buy the debut novel from a young man by the name of F. Scott Fitzgerald. Unfortunately, the editorial board recanted, and he had a long relationship with Fitzgerald, working on all of his books. And this letter actually shows an exchange from Perkins to Fitzgerald about a little manuscript then known only as Gatsby. He says, "I think you were right in feeling a certain slight sagging in chapters 6 and 7, and I don't know how to suggest a remedy, but I hardly doubt you will find one." So this is editor as coach. Editor is someone who notes where something isn't working or confirms a suspicion, but doesn't necessarily prescribe a solution. Jeff is going to talk about design reviews later today. I know this kind of comes up. Your job in those kinds of contexts isn't to say, you need to do this. It's to say, this isn't working. It probably would have been impossible for Perkins even to suggest a solution. Fitzgerald's novels were very tightly wound, Gatsby in particular. It would have been very difficult for him to have said, I think you need to do X, Y, and Z in order to make this work. All he needed to do was point out that it wasn't working and acknowledge that he had faith in him, that he could figure it out. The expression of faith being as much a part of that editorial relationship as anything else. Now, contrast this with another famous editor from the 20th century, the relationship between Raymond Carver and Gordon Lish. Lish was a very powerful editor. He had a very heavy hand. He not only cut deeply into Carver's stories, he on occasion rearranged the storylines, changed the endings, changed the names of characters. He got very deep into it. Carver actually, I think, felt this was injurious to his work, but he was young and unknown, and Lish promised him that he was going to be successful. He didn't have the kind of agency to push back. And it was very difficult for him when the books first hit the shelves, and he was praised for qualities that he felt were really Lish's doing, not his. It's only later in his career that he started to kind of push back. He sent a letter to Lish, pleading with him not to edit that way again. He wrote, I can't undergo the kind of surgical amputation and transplant that might make them some way fit into the carton so the lid will close. There's Procrustes. There's a little book called The Comedy of Survival by a man named Joseph Meeker. It's out of print and it has the most horrendous cover you've ever seen. If you look it up after this, please do not judge it by that. It proposes a play ethic. So it looks at the great Greek plays and Renaissance plays, the tragedies and the comedies that have so informed Western thought, and proposes that there's a way we can learn how to live in the world based on those plays. He says there are two modes that those plays propose. The first is the tragic mode. A tragic character is larger than life. He goes out into the world, he sees things that are not the way he wants them to be, and he goes out of his way to make the world a change to suit him. And of course, leaves a wide swath of blood behind him. And at the end of the play, he's carted off stage with his head on a sword. That's the tragic mode. Tragedies always end in funerals. The alternative is the comic mode. The comic mode says, the comic character looks at the world, sees that things are not quite going his way, but instead of making the world change for him, he changes to adapt. He responds to the situation that's around him. He maybe plays pranks or tries to be in the right place at the right time. He maneuvers, tries to get himself into the best situation, but he does not kill anyone. And a comedy always ends in a wedding. Not everyone is happy at the wedding, but they all survive the play. The editor lives in the comic mode. It's not the editor's job to go after a work and say, I need to make this like what I want it to be. It's the editor's job to go into a work and say, I need to make this the best version of what it is. And that's useful both for and how we engage with one another, and also in how we engage with our own work. So one of the things that I experience frequently is I'll have an idea, some fuzzy, hazy, foggy idea late at night, this amazing thing that I'm going to make or do. And then the next morning you get up and you start to do it. And inevitably the thing you start making is nowhere near as extraordinary as that thing you dreamed up the night before, right? And it's tempting to discard it as being worthless, or to fight with it, try to make it that magical, perfect thing that you had imagined. But there's another option, which is to accept it for what it is and figure out how it can be better at that. It's going to be different than what you imagined, but maybe still good. I'm going to come back to the note that Frank left for me, because he does something clever here. He calls me an axe sharpener. I wasn't the one who wielded the axe. I only sharpened the blade. There's a Confucian story about a butcher who tries to keep his knife sharp. He has a story about how he keeps his knife sharp. I want to share that with you. He says, a good cook changes his chopper once a year because he cuts. An ordinary cook once a month because he hacks. But I have had this chopper 19 years, and although I have cut up many thousand bullocks, its edge is as if fresh from the whetstone. For at the joints there are always interstices, and the edge of a chopper being without thickness, it remains only to insert that which is without thickness into such an interstice. By this means, the interstice will be enlarged, and the blade will find plenty of room. This is how I like to think about the cut, not as something that does violence, but that's something that finds a natural seam and opens it up. So if you're careful, if you're honest and respectful of the work, you can make a cut without ever spilling a drop of blood. Thank you.